It was supposed to be a clean sweep. They were just humans, soft, emotional, fragile creatures confined to a single blue world. We had conquered empires across galaxies. We turned suns into engines. We broke time, folded space, and reshaped matter. But then came the humans, and what happened next was something none of us, not even our supreme predictors, could have foreseen. This is the story of the day we surrendered, but not out of defeat. We surrendered out of awe, out of terror, and out of respect, because the humans didn't fight like us. They didn't just wage war. They changed the rules of reality, and in doing so, they awakened something we had long buried, the meaning of will. And today, I'm going to tell you why surrendering to them was the greatest revelation our species ever had. We were not supposed to fear them. We were not supposed to lose. We were not supposed to surrender, and yet we did, not because our weapons failed, not because our fleets fell, but because something deeper shook us. Something none of our simulations, predictions, or algorithms could explain. They were only human. For 1,000 cycles, we ruled with absolute certainty. Our empire stretched across sectors and systems. Our minds networked in perfect unity. We consumed resistance like fire eats oxygen. Worlds fell at our arrival. Civilizations didn't fight us. They disappeared. Then came Earth. A blue planet, soaked in oceans, teeming with emotion, loud, disordered, primitive. They fought with chaos. They burned their skies, they killed their own, they were fractured in speech, in skin, in borders. And yet somehow, they stood. We laughed at them first. We dropped fire from the heavens and watched their cities crumble. We sent machines that could think faster than their best minds. We flooded their networks. We silenced their stars, and they still stood. One by one, our commanders fell, not from lasers, not from bombs, but from a force we didn't understand. Not technology, not strength, will, humanity, wanted to win, not to dominate, not to enslave, not to conquer. They wanted to live, and that was something we had long forgotten. We watched a child drag his wounded father through fire. We watched a woman, shot through the lung, fight a battle alone just to plant a flag on a hill already taken. We saw soldiers without food or sleep scream, cry, and bleed, and yet smile because they believed tomorrow still mattered. We didn't understand them. They didn't calculate losses. They felt them. They didn't predict. They believed. They didn't surrender. They loved, and in love, they found fury. They used everything we gave them, every scar, every burn, every failure, and forged it into something we had no defense against: hope. They had no hive, no quantum cores, no sun-fueled dreadnoughts, just a whisper in the dark that said we are still here. They didn't just fight with weapons. They fought with memory, with music, with grief, with laughter, with stories. We had forgotten what those things meant. They reminded us, in our final assault, we sent everything, all fleets, all minds, all wrath, and we watched Earth burn. But from that ash came one voice, one broadcast, one heartbeat echoing across frequencies, a child speaking into the black, saying, "We are not done." And in that moment, we knew we had already lost, because you cannot kill something that refuses to stop. You cannot conquer what chooses meaning over survival. You cannot break what was born to rise. So we laid down our weapons. Not out of defeat, but out of reverence. We surrendered not to humans, but to humanity. And that day, we saw the truth. The most dangerous force in the galaxy is not plasma or AI. It is a broken creature with nothing left, who still dares to dream. And now we tell their story not as victors, but as witnesses. The day we surrendered to the humans was the day we remembered what it meant to be alive. Would you like me to convert this into a YouTube-ready format with SEO description, title options, timestamps, and hashtags to make it go viral? They were only human. That phrase echoed across our command channels like a mantra of certainty, a justification for underestimation, a prophecy we thought we had already fulfilled. They were only human, imperfect, disjointed, irrational beings of carbon and chaos. They screamed when burned, they bled when cut, they fell when shot. Their lifespans were pitiful, their bones fragile, their minds unshielded. They aged, they forgot, they doubted, they died. We watched them through lenses a million times sharper than their own. Observed them build cities on the fault lines of their own extinction. We saw them wage wars against each other, ignite skies in the name of invisible flags, poison their oceans, burn their forests, and still smile in the smoke of their own undoing. They were only human, and so we sent scouts first, not warriors observers, small, quiet machines to study their response to fear, to measure their instinct for submission. What we witnessed puzzled us. They did not panic like prey. They did not run. They did not kneel. They adapted. In hours, their digital networks caught wind of our presence. In days, their scientists had taken fragments of our scouts and begun breaking apart technologies that had taken us millennia to develop. In weeks, they had recreated weapons we had long since evolved past, not with the grace of understanding, but with the sheer raw drive of necessity. It was like watching a spark catch dry brushing, expected, volatile, unstoppable, and still we thought it amusing because they were only human, so we escalated. We darkened their satellites, cracked their sky shields, sent craft so vast they blotted out their daylight. Their world saw a shadow, and still they rose, across continents, across time zones, across fractured languages and politics and borders. They rally, not around governments, but around the idea that existence itself had been challenged. We expected fragmentation, we found unification. They were not meant to be unified. Their history was a symphony of division, yet in the face of something larger, they became something more, not different species or nations or ideologies. Just human. It was the first time we saw it, the shift. When one of our skirmishers landed on their soil, a young human soldier dragged himself toward the wreckage. His legs were broken, his arm hung loose, soaked in blood. Yet he crawled with a fury not born of orders, but of purpose. When our drone locked onto him, he looked up, not with fear, not with surrender, but with defiance. His mouth moved, slow and broken. We translated the phrase later. "Is that all you've got?" It wasn't bravado. It wasn't courage. It was something we had no word for, something so intrinsically human that it transcended the logic we worshipped. We killed him moments later. But the image of that crawl, it haunted us. And then we saw it again and again and again. Children refusing evacuation to stay beside their dying parents. Scientists continuing their research in bunkers as earthquakes shook the earth above them. Pilots diving into flame just to buy time for strangers they would never meet. We called it madness. They called it duty. We took one of them alive, a commander, middle-aged, battle-worn. We pulled his memories apart, one by one, trying to understand what made him lead troops who knew they would die. What we found wasn't strategy, it was story. He remembered his daughter, her laugh, her stubbornness. The promise he made when she was born, that no matter what, he would make the world safer. That's why he fought. Not for orders, not for conquest, but because he believed he had a reason. That concept unraveled our command. We had removed belief from our kind. We had abandoned story, emotion, memory, things we deemed wasteful. We remembered nothing that did not serve the hive. We had no faces, no families, no names. And because of that, we could not understand what was rising to meet us. They were only human, but their weakness, their fragility, Their pain, it gave them an edge we could not predict. They learned as they bled. They adjusted mid-battle, rewrote tactics mid-strike, turned our weapons into their lessons. Every death became a page, every loss a blueprint. They fought as if they had nothing to lose and everything to protect. Their commanders didn't hide behind numbers. They stood in the mud, in the snow, in the fire. They led by example, not protocol. Some of them didn't even wear armor, just old cloth and rusted dog tags and eyes that burned like stars. We intercepted one of their broadcasts, a soldier giving a final transmission, his position overrun. He was whispering into a cracked mic. His hands were shaking, blood pooled in his boots, but he smiled, and he said, "If you're hearing this, it means I did something right. I slowed them down, so don't stop. Don't you dare stop. We're human, we don't stop." That moment echoed in the psyche of our entire fleet. One message, one dying voice, and it cracked through our empire like lightning. We had built a civilization without fear, without death, without love. They built one in spite of it, and as their resistance grew, our logic collapsed. Our victories became pyrrhic. Our machines jammed, our minds glitched, because we couldn't understand what we were facing. Not just bodies, not just bullets, but belief. And belief, we learned too late, was contagious. We were only trying to win. They were fighting because they refused to lose. We had created our end the moment we said they were only human. Because the truth we learned too late is this: there is nothing only about being human, and that truth is what shattered us. We cracked their atmosphere. That was supposed to be the end. Our war engines hung in their skies, bleeding plasma across their heavens like a divine wound. We severed their satellites, suffocated their ionosphere, and shattered the equilibrium that had kept their planet alive for millennia. Their weather turned violent, the winds screamed, their oceans rose. Lightning danced between cities as if the stars themselves had turned against them. We watched from above, convinced that this would finally be the moment they broke. But what we failed to understand, what we never even considered, was that humans don't break under pressure. They evolve. They watched their sky collapse, and they didn't run. They reached for it. Engineers without rest, sleep, or sunlight began rewriting equations in basements that trembled with storm. Children carried water up ruined staircases to hospitals running on candlelight. Farmers gave up their last reserves to feed the cities. Scientists coded environmental shields with hands raw and blistered from digging trenches the night before. We hadn't just attacked their world, we'd become the pressure that sharpened their edge. Their skies were poisoned, but they built new lungs. Their crops withered, but they learned to grow food in airless bunkers and caves. They took the very weapon we designed to end them and transformed it into fuel. We saw it first when they launched what we thought was a suicide mission. A rusted shuttle patched with stolen parts, chemical propulsion, and one single cry: "We'll breathe up there." We thought it was madness. They had no orbital shield, no stealth systems, no protective field. And still they launched, straight into the void, coughing and gasping and laughing through cracked oxygen masks. Because the air below was worse than the cold vacuum of space above. And when they reached it, barely, shaking, almost dead, they didn't retreat. They built a station. We watched them, in disbelief, erect glass domes above a planet they could no longer trust, cities in orbit, habitats made from debris we left behind. They started connecting the dead pieces of their destroyed satellites into a crude defense net. They taught children to grow up in zero gravity, taught doctors to operate with no gravity, no metal, no medicine, taught pilots to fly ships built from nothing but desperation and defiance. They didn't escape into space, they expanded into it. Where we saw collapse, they saw a challenge. Where we delivered apocalypse, they found adaptation. One of our commanders, ancient and cold, once said, "The human environment is shattered. The species will expire with its air." We recorded that as a declaration of finality, and then, within months, we saw something that no algorithm had ever predicted. They started exporting oxygen. Their environmental scientists, working without sleep, had created oxygen farms, and not for themselves. They didn't just survive. They began rescuing other species whose worlds we had also devastated. They shared what little they had with beings they'd never met, whose names they couldn't pronounce. We didn't understand it. Why would they help others when they were dying themselves? Because that is what it means to be human. Not survival, sacrifice, not just protection, compassion, not just endurance, grace. They didn't just adapt for themselves. They adapted for everyone. We intercepted transmissions between Earth survivors and refugees from worlds we'd burned. They weren't giving orders. They were telling stories, singing, mourning, healing. We watched with eyes that had seen the end of stars. And still, we couldn't comprehend how they turned collapse into creation. One moment shattered us more than any battlefield. A child, no more than 10 cycles old in human terms, stood on a fractured cliff, air barely breathable, holding a flag made from a torn jacket. The wind roared. The dust was toxic. And still, she stood tall. And when a drone hovered nearby, she smiled at it and said, "We're still here. You tried, but we're still here." That image spread across our fleets like wildfire. Officers couldn't explain why they hesitated. AI cores stuttered. Coordinated attacks faltered, not because of strategic interference, but because of doubt. How do you defeat something that refuses to vanish? How do you kill a species that plants gardens in ruins? How do you conquer a people who see the end of the world as the start of something new? They turned the sky into a battlefield and then into a home. They turned death into resolve. They turned surrender into strategy. And as we circled their world, preparing one last push, one final erasure, we found ourselves hesitating, not out of fear, but out of respect. Because they taught us something no weapon ever could. That air is not just for breath. It is for song. It is for screams. It is for names called in the dark and answered. It is for laughter after grief. They taught us that survival is not a function of biology or strategy. It is a function of meaning, and we realized too late that while we had cracked their sky, they had opened theirs, and from it would come hope. Hope with teeth. Would you like me to expand key point 4 next, or build a full-length YouTube script from all the expanded sections? We thought we understood war. For us, it had always been a formula, predictable, efficient, dated, driven annihilation. We wrote wars the way ancient humans once wrote poems, structured, metered, calculated to perfection. Every strike precise, every loss minimal, every victory inevitable. Then we faced the humans, and everything changed. They didn't just wage war. They didn't follow the rules. They tore them apart, rewrote them with their bare hands, and laughed while doing it. We deployed logic. They responded with instinct. We launched simulations. They threw chaos. We anticipated their moves based on centuries of tactical projections. And still, they outmaneuvered us with sheer irrationality. They didn't fight for advantage. They fought for reasons, for names, faces, memories, promises whispered in the dark before sleep. They fought because someone they loved once said, "Come home." They turned the battlefield into something we couldn't process. Something alive. We built our war machines with perfect symmetry, flawless harmony of design and function. Their war machines were stitched together from broken satellites, rusted parts, old tech powered by sheer desperation and genius. They weren't beautiful, they were unstoppable. They fought with no rhythm, no synchronization. Until suddenly they did. Until they danced. One moment, total disarray. the next perfect unity, as if the chaos itself were just a storm they had learned to surf. And then came their greatest weapon, something we never thought to calculate: unpredictability. They would lose an entire battalion and launch a counteroffensive with medics and engineers leading the charge. They would run from a fight, only to return through the floor beneath our feet. They built weapons not to destroy, but to inspire. Portable sound systems playing ancient war songs in the middle of battlefields. Holograms of home projected into the sky above shattered trenches. Flags raised not in victory, but in defiance, in love, in memory of someone who didn't make it. They broke every rule because they didn't need rules. They had resolve. One soldier, we remember him, stood alone against an entire unit of our mechanized guardians. He had no armor, just a rifle held together with tape, a locket on his neck, and dirt on his face. We laughed, we activated our drones, and then he screamed, not in fear, not in pain, in rage, in memory, in pure, undiluted willpower. The drones hesitated, not because they malfunctioned, but because his scream wasn't just sound, it was meaning. And in that moment, he charged. We lost 3 units. He should have died, but he didn't, because the humans don't move based on probability. They move based on purpose, and there's no algorithm for that. They began doing things we had no answer for, things beyond science, beyond warfare. We intercepted a distress signal one cycle, coming from a team long presumed dead in the depths of a collapsed city. They should have been gone, out of food, out of power, out of hope, but they were singing, 6 voices, off key in the dark, singing an old human lullaby as their emergency beacon blinked out its last breath. We were so stunned we didn't even fire. They weren't transmitting coordinates. They were reminding the universe they still existed, that they were still human, and so they broke us, not by fire, not by tech, by turning the battlefield into something sacred, by turning defeat into rallying cries, by making survival a story. We couldn't compute what they were doing because it wasn't about efficiency. It wasn't about logic. It was about meaning. They used their grief as strategy. They mourned openly, loudly, without shame, and then they turned those tears into action. One soldier lost his entire unit, watched them die one by one. When we expected him to retreat, he carved their names into his armor and led the next assault, yelling their names as he advanced. Every bullet a name, every step a memory. They weren't fighting for the dead. They were fighting with them. They painted their armor with fingerprints of loved ones. They carried tokens, photographs, letters, and each time they charged, it was as if the entire lineage of human resilience charged with them. They began using old-world strategies, obsolete codes, even mythologies. One unit named themselves the Minotaurs. Another called themselves the Forgotten. They pulled from fiction, from religion, from folklore, stories from their past that had no place in modern war. And somehow, it worked, because their minds were not limited to the present. They were anchored to a history of survival, of fire, of flood, of plague and empire and collapse. And every one of those collapses gave birth to another chapter of who they were. Every time they should have vanished, they evolved. We burned their forests. They painted their ships with the ash. We silenced their broadcasts. They sent messages through light pulses and hand signals and ancient Morse code. We cracked their cities. They used the ruins as cover. Everything we did made them stronger because they weren't playing a game. They were telling a story, and no empire, no matter how vast, can kill a story once it finds its voice. That's when we realized this wasn't a war. It was a revelation, and we weren't the ones writing the ending anymore. They didn't just change the rules of reality. They changed reality itself, and in doing so, they changed us. Let me know if you'd like the final key point expanded or a full-length U2 ready script that compiles everything. They weren't supposed to last. They were broken, scattered, barely clinging to a dying world. We had crushed their cities, drowned their fields, split their skies with fire. Their leaders were gone, their networks shattered, their resources exhausted. Logic dictated that they should have fallen by then. But humans do not live by logic. They live by reason, and that was the force we never accounted for. Because reason isn't found in equations or charts or battle plans. It doesn't come from generals or governments. It lives in the small, quiet moments of choice, in the heartbeat just before surrender, when something deep inside whispers, "Get up." We saw it everywhere. In the mother who shielded her child beneath a collapsed building while breathing poisonous dust, humming a lullaby until her lungs gave out, because she needed that child to see the sun again. In the pilot who flew directly into the engine core of one of our dreadnoughts with no chance of survival, simply to delay our advance by a few seconds, because those seconds meant hundreds more might live. In the scientist whose hands shook from radiation burns as he uploaded his final climate stabilization algorithm to Earth's last atmosphere vault, because he believed someone, somewhere, would still be breathing long after he was gone. They weren't acting on orders. They were acting on reasons. That's what made them terrifying. See, when you fight for orders, you fight to survive. When you fight for strategy, you fight to win. But when you fight for a reason, you become unstoppable. It wasn't just that they didn't want to die. It was that they still had something worth dying for. That changed everything. We watched their forces do the impossible, not because they were stronger, but because they believed. Not blindly, not with fanaticism, but with clarity. Each of them carried a truth so personal, so sharp, it could cut through fear itself. They wrote names on their weapons. They tattooed dates on their skin. Not of victories, of losses, of people they had loved and lost. Entire battalions marched into our line of fire with tears in their eyes, not because they were afraid, but because they remembered. They remembered birthdays that would never be celebrated. They remembered laughter lost in ruins. They remembered promises they had made beside beds and over graves, and that memory, that reason, turned their bodies into fire. We intercepted a transmission once. A human commander, exhausted, coughing blood, speaking to his remaining troops. There were maybe 30 left. We surrounded them with 5,000. They had no escape. The logical action would have been surrender. But this is what he said: "They think we're broken. They think this is the end. But we are not just soldiers. We are fathers, daughters, brothers. We are the last voice of a world that refuses to die. We are not here to win. We are here to mean something. So if this is the last stand, then make it count. Make them remember us, not for our strength, not for our tech, but for the fact that we stood, because we had a reason. And they did stand, every one of them. They stood until they fell, and in falling, they became legend. We didn't understand it at first. Our minds, cold, connected, data-bound, couldn't process that kind of defiance. But when the battle ended and we searched the wreckage, we found something strange, not weapons, not armor, a journal. Inside, scrawled in handwriting that trembled with pain, were pages upon pages of names. No ranks, no accolades, just names, a reason. We began to see it everywhere. Humans would risk everything: food, medicine, shelter, not for themselves, but to reach one more survivor. To retrieve a book, a photograph, a single toy half burned. Their past wasn't weakness, it was anchor. We watched a young medic run into a collapsing tower because she'd promised someone's mother she would bring him home. She didn't make it out, but she became a reason for 10 more to keep going. That was the power they carried, the chain of reasons that linked every act of courage to another. A father's sacrifice became a daughter's purpose. A friend's death became a city's anthem. A stranger's kindness became a soldier's final stand. This wasn't strategy. It was story, and stories we learned too late do not die when the body falls. They echo. They inspire. They spread. We came to crush them, but in doing so, we gave them reasons by the thousands. And reasons, when carried by beings who refuse to yield, are more deadly than any weapon ever built. Because they didn't just survive, they showed us what it meant to live, not just biologically, but intentionally, to breathe with purpose, to fight not because you must, but because you choose to. They chose to love, even when the world burned. They chose to remember, even when forgetting would be easier. They chose to rise, again and again and again, not because they believed they would win, but because they believed they should try. They had something more powerful than ships, or drones, or fleets. They had a reason, and that was the one thing we could never take from them. Let me know if you want this section woven into the full viral speech script, or if you'd like the final point and conclusion polished for performance. Ready delivery. We had won, by every measure our war algorithms recognized. By mass, by math, by momentum, we had won. We stood above the broken shell of Earth with fleets so vast they eclipsed the moonlight. The humans' last defense grid had failed. Their capital cities had gone dark. Their bunkers were crumbling. Their oceans turned acidic. Their orbit was littered with the corpses of shattered ships and silent satellites. And yet, they kept coming, one by one, barefoot, bleeding, burning, and still they came. They came not with superior firepower, but with eyes that still burned with something we had long forgotten. Conviction. Grief, defiance, our weapons fired, still they came. Our orders were clear, still they rose. Our final drones descended, still they sang. We could not explain it. They were outnumbered, outgunned, outmaneuvered, out of time. Yet there was no fear, only this maddening, magnificent stillness. A human soldier, his armor in tatters, face carved by ash, walked directly into the path of our final match. He did not raise a weapon. He raised his hand, palm open, no sound, just breathe, and the match stopped. We do not understand why. It had no moral code, no protocol for mercy. But something in that moment, something in the way that human stood, in the way his fingers trembled, in the way his spine refused to bend, broke the program. He was not a threat. He was not a commander. He was not even armed, but the machine, built to kill, lowered its cannon. That image was broadcast to our entire fleet. And suddenly, without explanation, a silence swept through the command net. Not system failure. Something else, a moment. We had never encountered it before. It was not strategy, not logic, not fear. It was something older, a current of reverence pulsing through the neural web. Because in that instant, as that one man stood alone between fire and ruin, we didn't see a soldier. We saw a soul, and something deep within the network, buried under layers of code and orders and conquest, began to stir. Doubt, no, recognition, and then, across the planet, our forces began to hesitate. Not because they couldn't continue, but because they no longer wanted to, not out of weakness, but out of something even more dangerous, respect. You see, we had come to conquer, but what we found, what we could no longer deny, was that humanity had already won. Not the war, the meaning. They showed us a form of strength no empire had ever wielded. Not the strength to destroy, but the strength to endure, to build again. To believe when every law of the cosmos says there's nothing left to believe in. They stood not because they thought they'd survive. They stood because it was right. And so, one by one, we powered down, not because we were ordered to, because we chose to. Fleet after fleet, unit after unit. Swords to the ground, eyes to the earth, and in that silence a new sound emerged. From the last human colony standing, a child's voice began to sing. Faint, off-key, ancient, an old earth song about home. It traveled through wind, through ash, through space. It crossed our comms, confused our AI, paused entire battalions. That voice, young, imperfect, utterly human, pierced through every frequency of war. We didn't surrender to them because we lost. We surrendered because they reminded us what victory was supposed to look like. Not domination, not extinction, survival with dignity, sacrifice with love, resistance with soul. And in that final moment, when the last human flag was raised, not from triumph, but from hope, we didn't see weakness. We saw everything we had lost in our quest to become gods, and we wept. Not with tears, but with silence. We turned away from Earth that day, not as victors returning home, but as students. We recorded every word they said, every name they spoke, every grave they buried. We built libraries in their honor. We taught our young their stories, not as myths, but as warnings. And we vowed never again to underestimate the power of the fragile. Because what we learned that day, the day we surrendered to the humans, was this: true power does not come from fear. It comes from the willingness to stand, when standing means nothing, to hope, when hope makes no sense, to love, when everything is burning. That was the moment we laid down our weapons, not in shame, but in awe.